Taylor Majors for Andress Engineering, trackmobile dealer for the southeastern United States. Welcome to Tracking. We've got a great show for you this morning. This morning we're going to take a look back at the state of rail so far in 2022. We'll also take a look at the greater overall economy and how things are moving in the rail industry. Let's get right to the numbers. The U.S. economy through the first part of the year has been a confusing ride. High consumer and manufacturing demand are competing with multi-decade level inflation and lower consumer savings rates. One will have to give. Railcar loadings have been much the same, seesawing between promising and discouraging. Through the first 5 months of 2022, total U.S. non-coal railcar loadings are down 1.7% versus 2021. We are well below 2019 levels and not incredibly far above 2020. Especially considering where we were in early June of 2020. With the exception of February, which was lapping the 2021 Texas winter storm, every month in 2022 has been down over the same month in 2021. Intermodal loadings are much the same, down 6.6 year to date with this time last year. Port congestion continues to be an issue as ship dwell times remain at elevated levels. Also, the recent COVID lockdowns in China have affected international shipping. We would caveat intermodal set records in the first half of last year, so the downdraft doesn't seem quite as hard compared to long-term rates. Still, for a supposedly recovering economy, these are mixed signals at best. So, if we're living in a post-pandemic world, and there's apparently more demand than the economy can supply as given by our inflation rates, then why are railcar loadings down? We'll chew on this for a few minutes and we'll come back to it. To tackle that question, let's turn to the broader economy. To start with, if loadings are down, is the economy as solid as we think it is? U.S. GDP for quarter 1 of 2022 was reported at negative 1.5% quarter over quarter. Current estimates for quarter 2 are for plus 2.1%, with annual estimates still ranging around 2%. That is in line with what many economists consider long-term trend growth. It is well off levels expected by an economy that's still recovering from a worldwide pandemic, though. As recently as last year, economists were calling for a growth in the 4 to 5% range. We seem to be falling short of that mark considerably. Many reasons were given for the surprise slowdown in the first quarter. Depending on the hue of your colored glasses, you could see the economy in a positive or a negative light right now. Highlighting the positive, personal consumption and expenditures was up 2.09%. A consumer-driven economy looks to this number first when measuring the recent health of the economy. That gain was entirely attributed to an increase in service expenditures, though, while goods remained flat quarter over quarter. Making up for the losses in other categories, motor vehicles and parts, despite still low inventories, was a strong contributor. However, after stronger sales in Q1, May's 2022 annualized auto sales rate was back to just over 12.7 million, a paltry number against an economy that was doing 17 or so million cars per year in the years leading up to the pandemic. The increasing trade deficit was the largest single contributor to the GDP slowdown. Increased imports, along with less total exports, contributed to a negative 3.2% GDP percentage drop. Other decreases were related to reduced military spending and government spending. As railcar loadings are almost strictly attributable to physical goods, the reduction in railcar loadings matches more closely with a flat goods sector reading quarter over quarter. Likely the strongest indicator for the good economy camp is still the robust jobs market. On June 3rd, the Bureau of Labor Statistics released its employment reading of a preliminary 390,000 net new jobs created in the month of May 2022. With this report, the headline unemployment rate is now at 3.6%, just about back to the 3.5% recorded in February 2020, the month before the pandemic. That said, the total net new jobs created since May 2020 now totals a little over 21.1 million jobs. In March and April of 2020, 22 million jobs were reported lost. We are still 819,000 fewer total jobs than there were before the pandemic. So how can we have a 3.6% unemployment rate? As we've discussed before, the unemployment rate measures those working or actively seeking work. Millions of job seekers fell off the board during the pandemic, whether early retirements or marginal workers who have yet to come back to the labor force. We have a labor force participation rate at 62.3% as of May. In February 2020, the LFPR was 63.4%, just over a full percentage point higher than where we stand today. So how many missing workers does that equate to? Well, a May Kansas City Federal Reserve article cites approximately 2 million less workers are still missing from the workforce as compared with 2019 levels. We point out this number specifically because we feel it's one of the best comparisons for the reported unemployment rate versus the total number of people actually working. It also lends explanation to how an economy considered at near full employment with less than 4% unemployment rate can keep adding 400,000 plus jobs per month. It's largely workers coming back into the workforce. The takeaway from that being that the labor market may still have some room yet to expand and produce more jobs. Further complementing the employment train, on June 1st, the Bureau of Labor Statistics released its Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, or JOLTS, for the month of April. On the last day of April, there were 11.4 million available jobs in the U.S. While that's down slightly from the record in March, it's almost twice the number of job seekers currently actively considered in the unemployment rate. If we can add a small bit of anecdotal commentary, a high JOLTS to unemployment ratio often means that companies cannot find people with the skills required to fill their position needs. While this creates inefficiency in the markets, the longer this goes on, the more willing companies will be to train people with new skills to meet these roles. This increases the overall productivity of the labor force and equips people with new skills they will carry with them going forward. With more people working and bringing home incomes, the economic optimists will posit inflation will eventually tamp down, but these new jobs will carry forward. Turning to the other side of the coin, inflation and the savings rate. A strong labor market combined with still largely positive economic surveys point toward a fairly rosy picture. The pessimist case revolves around inflation and fast dwindling consumer savings rates. You may remember in the March 21 State of Rail report, we reported that consumer savings rates had reached near record levels. A combination of government helicopter cash and lockdowns preventing spending left consumers with full piggy banks and a lot of pent-up demand. While that pent-up demand has not yet shown major signs of slowing, as highlighted by the consumer spending we discussed above, the cracks are beginning to show. The April personal savings rate, as reported by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, was down to 4.4%. It's been ticking down month after month and has now reached below long-term savings levels. As consumers have lessened savings, they traditionally turn to credit sources like credit cards and home equity loans before eventually reducing their spending habits. You can see this in the Federal Reserve's June 7th release of the Consumer Credit Report. In April, revolving credit, which is mostly credit cards, increased at an annual rate of 19.6%. That's up almost 20% if we went to the same rate for a year. That is in addition to March's 29% reading. That means the amount of short-term credit, like credit cards, consumers took out increased about $40 billion in April. The other headwind for the economy, inflation. Inflation remains at or near multi-decade highs, as we've not seen inflation like this since the Carter 70s and early 80s, or 40 plus years for those keeping score at home. Many consumers have never experienced an environment like this. Inflation, as reported by the Consumer Price Index in April 2022, was 8.3% year over year, a small drop from the March high of 8.5%. Inflation is in everything too. Some standouts over the past year: food is up 9.4% year over year. Energy is up 30.3%. You all know that from seeing gasoline, which is up 43% in just a year. Not to be lost in the energy shuffle, it's not just your transportation energy either. Electricity is up 11% over April 2021. Utility gas service, natural gas, is up 22.7%. The increase in basic expenses hits consumers right in the pocketbook and limits the amount of discretionary income remaining for purchases and services like dining out or buying goods. Included in the BLS labor report, average hourly earnings are up 5.3% over the past 12 months. Compared with an inflation rate of 8.3%, that means real wages in terms of purchasing power, how far your dollar will go, have gone down over the past 12 months. If inflation doesn't dissipate, workers will continue to see their dollar carry less power going forward. Speaking of that lower purchasing power, another indirect effect of inflation is increased loan rates for purchases by way of rate increases by the Federal Reserve. This affects all parts of the industrial and consumer economy. For companies, it means a higher cost of borrowing for investments into new equipment and expansions. For consumers, it means higher loan rates for purchases, specifically homes and autos. When we mentioned before, new auto purchases for May were reported at a seasonally adjusted 12.7 million. Pricing and vehicle availability are certainly still playing a role in that new and used auto prices are both up double digits year over year. Used car prices are up over 30% in a year. Interest rates also play a huge contributing role to that. The average new car payment in Q1 of 2022 has now reached a record of $648 per month. That is largely before many of the interest rate increases started taking place too, so we expect to see that continuing to rise in the next several months. In what may be a small blessing, the slowdown in vehicle purchases may give dealerships time to restock inventories that have been severely depleted for more than a year. Increased inventories means less inflation. An even better example of how interest rates affect the greater economy: housing. New housing starts in April were still near multi-year highs. New housing starts in April 2022 were 1.724 million. That is near the highest levels since the pre-08 recession. It's important to remember, though, that the largest U.S. generation ever, millennials, are now well into their family-forming years. That, combined with the 2010s decade that saw the lowest housing building levels in decades, created an enormous amount of pent-up demand. That demand hit flood-level proportions during the pandemic as millennials traded in the city for suburban living and smaller cities. So what does that have to do with interest rates? In just a few months, mortgage rates have gone from historic lows to 12-year highs, as cited by a Reuters article on May 18th. On May 26th, the Mortgage Brokers Association reported the average median mortgage payment in April 2022 was $1,889. Up from $1,736 in just March. That's an average payment increase of 8.8% in just a month. Compared with a year before, the typical principal and interest payment has increased by $569 a month. That's practically a car payment. We discussed rapidly rising home prices before, combined with increases in mortgage loan rates. Home affordability continues to go down month after month. So, if this report has a theme, it's been cracks. The forward-looking indicator for the housing market is permit applications for future builds. The cracks may be starting to show here. New building permits dropped 3.2% in April. Also, while housing starts remain high, the percentage of multifamily starts, or apartments, is becoming a larger percentage of the total new starts. Of that 3.2% total drop, single-family home permits dropped 4.6%, while multifamily permits dropped only 0.6%. Remember, this is the April data, and prices and rates have continued to rise since. So going back to our consumer economy point, the more consumers spend on basic necessities like food, housing, and transportation, the less they have to spend on consumable goods, the same goods that travel in rail cars. Turning back to the rail sector, let's take a look at how some specific car commodity categories have done in 2022. Like we mentioned at the top, through May, total ex-coal railcar loadings are down 1.7% versus through this time in 2021. That's the fewest total number of railcars since before 2013, with the exclusion of 2020 when we were in the throes of the pandemic. Chemical car loadings are the single biggest commodity category excluding coal. In May, chemical car loadings were down 1.4% versus May 2021, but chemicals overall this year have continued to be strong, and they're up 6.6% from 2021. Chemicals have been a standout and a bright spot over the last several years as a growing part of the U.S. economy. They now make up a little over 14% of total carloads. Grain, or corn, wheat, and soy, loadings for 2022 are down 10.3% compared to this time 2021. That said, 2021 was a record year for grain loadings. We are still near historic highs, and where grain goes the rest of the year, that's what's going to be interesting. I'm sure you've heard and seen reports by now calling Ukraine the breadbasket of Europe. That can be illustrated by the 10-year wheat futures chart that you see on your screen. The yellow section highlighted is around February the 24th, when the Russian army fully moved into an invasion of Ukraine. As you can see, wheat was already at multi-year highs before skyrocketing around the beginning of the invasion. It has retraced some, but seems to be forming a base around the $1,050 level. That would be a sustained level higher than anything we've seen in the last 10 years. One commodity category that has been a beneficiary of higher oil prices is crushed stone, sand, and gravel. These are used primarily in the fracking industry. Year to date, this commodity category is up 10% over this time in 2021. May was the highest volume month since the later half of 2019. The Baker Hughes rig count corroborates this increase, as the rig count has increased by over 30% in the last year. Hopefully, some of these additional rigs will add some supply to the market and start cooling off gas prices. Perhaps not, though. May 2022, petroleum products were down 13.5% from May 2021. Truthfully, though, this speaks more to where oil is produced in the U.S. In the U.S., most oil production moves by pipeline. Still, the EIA does not expect U.S. oil crude production to return to 2020 levels until well into 2023. Expectations for 2022 are around 12 million barrels per day produced. Industrial products. A combination of 7 industrial-facing rail commodity sectors is the most historically correlated with GDP. Through May 2022, carloads of industrial products have totaled just over 1.9 million carloads. That is up 1.8% through May 2021. But it's the lowest reading in almost 10 years, excluding 2020 and 2021. We are still off the roughly 2 million carload mark we've been averaging through the most of the 2010s, as you see in the chart on your screen. That's all the time we've got for today. Thank you for joining us for tracking. For all your trackmobile, railcar mover, module ergonomic smart belt, crane, or compressor needs, you can contact Andress Engineering or visit www.andressengineering.com. For Taylor Majors and Andress Engineering, thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep it on the rails.